Welcome to another episode of Eric Waite Whiskey Studies, and we're continuing our study of the history of Scotch whiskey. In this episode, we're going to be looking at some of the innovations in the technology and the development of organic chemistry and understanding of barley and how it affected the history of Scotch whiskey and its production. So in our last video, we saw how blended Scotch whiskeys and various laws that took place, and the formulation of new distilleries and partnerships in the Scotch whiskey industry helped expand and grow Scotch whiskey. Well, in this video, we're going to see how new innovations and technology and so forth likewise contributed to the expansion of Scotch whiskey. While I'm going over my notes, I'm going to be enjoying a glass of the Port Charlotte 2007 CC01 heavily peated Islay single malt. In the last video, I was enjoying a glass of the Bruichladdich Octomore 8.1. So this is another heavily peated whiskey, probably not quite as much as the Octomore. All right, let's get into our notes. As the expansion of distilling capacity continued, so the second half of the 19th century also saw technical developments within the whiskey making sector. More stable yeast reduced the violence of fermentation, which meant washbacks were less likely to overflow. Steam heating of pot stills provided a more consistent source of heat than traditional direct coal firing, leading to a more consistent spirit, though the use of coal remained widespread until the 1960s and even beyond. When Glenmorangie Distillery in Ross-shire was rebuilt during 1887, steam coils were installed in the stillhouse in place of the previous fires, and in his distilleries of the United Kingdom, published the same year, Alfred Barnard notes that just 5 Scottish distilleries using steam as a heat source for stills, implying that this was a recent innovation. The traditional method of condensing spirit from vapor into liquid had been a long coiled copper pipe or worm immersed in cold water in a large wooden vat or tub, but shell and tube condensers were introduced in some distilleries around the same time. This led to a slightly lighter bodied spirit due to less overall copper contact than when worm tubs were in place. So when I visited Scotland in June 2018, I still saw some variation in whether it's cooling condensers or worm tubs being in essentially like a swimming pool of water. So they still exist. Writing of Glenmorangie Distillery in Peterhead, Barnard declares that in connection with a wash still, we noticed a horizontal condenser of a very modern design. And with reference to Ben Wyvis in Dingwall, he describes the wash still vapor being condensed in a tubular condenser on the principle of old-fashioned worms, but much more economical of water and space and more rapid in its action. Mechanized drum maltings also replaced distillery floor maltings in a number of instances, and when Speyburn in Rothes was constructed during 1897, it became the first distillery in Scotland to be equipped with drum maltings. As with steam heating, the objective was greater consistency. Moss and Hume, authors of The Making of Scotch Whisky, add that on the scientific side, the improvement of methods of analysis and a growing knowledge of organic chemistry, biochemistry, and microbiology gradually led to better yields, an informed choice of grain and malt, and a reduction in infection during fermentation.
I love Scotch. Scotchy Scotch, Scotch.
So there are still, if I recall correctly, 8 distilleries in Scotland that still do the floor maltings. A couple of them on Islay, such as Lagavulin, Bruichladdich. But a lot of times, even they can't produce enough malted barley for their own needs. So they sort of get other maltings, say from Port Ellen, to supplement their own floor malts. So the vast majority of distilleries are actually getting their malt from malters. They don't each individually have a drum malt in order to produce their malt, but rather they're getting what they need for their own production from those who focus on just producing malted barley. This is similar to the wine industry, in which there are some wineries, they may have their own vineyards and produce estate wines, but it's not enough to supply their needs, and so they go to other businesses which just focus on growing grapes in order to meet their full supply. Alrighty, so I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you subscribe to this channel, I want to thank you very much. If you haven't yet subscribed, but you like watching my videos, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe. Give this video a thumbs up, and in our next episode, we're going to talk about Speyside, the ascendancy of Speyside, and how it became the major player and reputation of Scotch whiskey industry. All right, until next time, cheers.